right, hello, 501 educational technology class. And for anyone who might be listening in the world, I guess it's open to the whole world. I don't know how many people are listening to this. But my name is Dominic Minicello.
I'm Georgia Marjotis.
And I'm Chris Tofton.
And for our topic for the podcast this week, it was the second module on social media. This one dealt more with education, though, specifically. And we are titling it Social Media in Education, Boon or Bane. There was one podcast we listened to, and then two more kind of scholarly articles we looked at. So we'll just jump right in then with some thoughts on the podcast. Georgia, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I thought this was a very interesting podcast to listen to. I enjoyed listening to the history and the background as to why the Telegraph was created, the whole story about the need for messages to be delivered more quickly. And it reminded me a lot about our podcast from last week with the novel and the pushback that the Telegraph faced, just like the novel did. And I believe that the point that I was able to connect to mostly was the negative views that people held against telegraphs due to the misinformation, the hoaxes, the loss of privacy, and the corruption of morality that they believed that telegraphs would bring, specifically in girls. They believed that if they were to work in these centers where they would be handling telegraphs with other males, there would be a lot of corruption of morality. And I think that is very relevant to today if you think about how much we discuss how social media could be corrupting our morals nowadays with everything we see.
Yeah, and seems to be the theme on this, the whole title of the Pessimist Archive podcast, is the kind of panic people have with the introduction of new technology. They're always pretty slanted in the other direction, but I think that's a good thing since a lot of people do have that knee-jerk reaction to see new technology as a threat. What did you think, Chris? Any specific thoughts on the podcast?
I thought it was when I was first listening to it, I don't know what my expectation was, but when they were talking about the guy who was like Samuel Morris, seemed to be, very critical of the Telegraph, but he seemed to get involved after, like, when he received contact of his wife being sick, and then the next day his wife died. He seemed to be very involved with the Telegraph on top of the inventor. And they said that basically he, traveled. He did a lot of work with the back end of communications and met a lot of resistance. I mean, they even talked about him going to Congress and trying to get money to get this started. And they were mentioning that the congressman said, that they weren't even going to vote for it because they didn't want to be responsible for the corruption that it could cause in society. So it was actually seemed to be a big social issue based on that. I guess you would call that the Victorian time.
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty amazing that they would go to that level to just not have their name attached to it.
Yeah. And it's hard to put yourself in those shoes, how revolutionary an idea it is. That seems beyond belief when you go from delivering something physically via horse to sending messages over hundreds of miles in just less than a minute or a couple minutes across the ocean. I had similar thoughts to you too.
I think it's very important that you mentioned that big transition from delivering something physically to delivering it, via telegraph, and how big that must have been for the time. And that's something I also thought about a lot. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And one of the biggest arguments that I definitely concurred with was that of technology not creating human actions, but actually unlocking them.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. The potential has always been within us. It's just a matter of, does the technology allow for it once we figure it out? Cool. So, and unless anyone has any further thoughts on the podcast, I figure we get to the first reading.
Yeah, just one connection I wanted to make with that as well is, I don't know if you heard in the podcast, they didn't get really specific into it, just a connection to one of our previous, how people borrow technology to create other technology, how they talked about the electromagnet and how he borrowed that technology and that helped him implement that into the wiring of it. That was just something I wanted to make a connection, that all the technology wasn't just him. It was, he did borrow technology from other people who had created things before him. So I think that also, I don't know if that constituted more fear of people them taking it because that technology, and that's why they didn't understand it. So
I think that's a great point, how you mentioned that technology comes from technology, and that goes hand in hand with the idea that our voices get louder with each technological creation. Our voices get louder with telegraphs than with telephones, than with the internet. Now we have 5G, for example. And again, we see this backlash, but also this excitement. So you still have both sides. No matter the medium, you still have the pros and the cons, and you have both sides with both fear as well as excitement. So,
yeah, totally. And it feels, whatever the change is, it feels revolutionary to and overwhelming to that specific generation. Like, I know each time it's like, well, this is unprecedented, but this podcast does show you that it always feels unprecedented because it is to every generation that has to write out the changes, make the most of the changes.
And I think that ties excellently with our readings, which we will get into right now, which discuss incorporating social media in education. The reason that I state that is because we're so used to, at least our teachers, we're so used to teaching with the book and the blackboard. And now we see this this development. We have whiteboards now. We have electronic smart boards in the classroom. We have iPads. We have laptops for students to use. And people took a while to get used to that. And now we have this new movement, which is to incorporate social media in the classroom. So I think it's interesting to see, will there again be backlash and excitement on both sides?
Yeah. And with in the first reading, I've got a bunch of kind of scattered ideas here, but one you reminded me of is this issue where sometimes we can, or especially teachers or administrators can view the flashiness of a technology as long as we incorporate that, somehow it's good because it keeps us ahead of the curve in terms of getting rusty with our technical skills. But I think, I can't speak for everyone, but you do have the experience most people do of when a piece of technology is introduced in a clunky way, or the software has not been designed well enough, it can have the opposite effect, because ultimately the goal should be the quality of the learning happening. The technology is just the mediator that allows that. Sometimes you have this thing where there's a term, the map is not the territory. And I'd heard it through listening to this guy, Robert Anton Wilson, talk, but apparently it's traced to scientist Alfred Korbisky. But it's this kind of thing where the technology sometimes can be the map, but the territory is what you're using the technology to get to. And sometimes you can get that backwards. And Chris, I know maybe with your teaching job, I remember when I was teaching, I was a middle school teacher for the last 7 years before I moved to New York. And you can get an apathy with teachers when a platform is introduced and then you take the time to learn all its quirks, and maybe it's not that well designed software wise. And then the next year, the admin says, we're going to move in another direction and use this sort of learned thing. And then the next time it keeps rolling. So you can get kind of cynical teachers that say, I'm not going to bother learning this thing because I know it's going to be not used next year. Now, I know someone like you, Chris, may love that stuff since you like diving into the details of technology. For me, it's more burdensome and stressful. But I guess that depends. Yeah.
As long as you have a plan, like what I see, when I was even looking at the Twitter reading or like the Greenhow or the Lewin reading about social media, I wasn't big into social media when I started. It didn't thrill me because I was there when they first released it. I mean, I remember when Google was released. That's how long I've been teaching. I was actually at the Javits Center when they turned it on. So
Oh, wow.
I remember that day, and I was like, I wish I had like $25 to invest in it, knowing how big it was going to be. So that's kind of how, even taking this class is, they didn't have these type of tech classes when we were going to school. They had like special education, or they had English or art, and I was always wondering how to combine a degree, which they wouldn't let you do that then. They let you do it now. They let you make your own degree path. Where I have actually one of my interns became a communications major, and then he incorporated puppeteering in it. I don't know if you saw him. He was in Newsday. He works for Jim Henson now. He used to work for me making educational videos for the Delphi University. So that's I never knew what making educational videos were until we came up with a model of just how they're coming up with a model for social media. Like, how do you make social media videos, or how do you make podcasts, or how do you make educational videos? There was no book. So basically you had to come up with some of the previous things people have done, like how to write a script for a movie, or what to say when you're actually or what expression you want to do to get people to learn. Are they hearing what you're saying? And I think that has a lot to do with what we're also working about with social media, is even people like myself in technology. It took me a long time to warm up to it because I didn't really trust the public part of it.
Yeah.
Because my fear was the kids being on social media and being exposed, and I'm the one who has nightmares at night about my son being online because I know what can happen, because people usually call me when that happens.
Yeah, no doubt. Like a lot of the stuff that we talked about last week, that like life destroying stuff. And it seemed like they touch on that in this first reading, but was kind of surprisingly positive, because I guess the reading, it's like they had one big study that they focused on in Europe, and then one in the US where they use this part of Facebook, I guess, called Hot Dish. But one thing I took from both, guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but they found that the students were actually pretty disciplined or content oriented using this stuff instead of immediately going to social aspects of it or other non-related distractions, which was kind of reassuring given the age level they were dealing with.
I think that that's something that the teacher themselves also has to decide. I think that's a personal decision as to how comfortable are you with your technological skills. How competent and capable do you feel that you can control students, or at least discipline them and make sure that they're doing what they should be doing. Because I think we've all seen how even regardless of social media, when there's a teacher in the classroom that does not have adequate knowledge of their students and their behaviors, it's very easy for them to lose control. It's very easy for students to take the upper hand, take control of the classroom, and sort of the teacher loses that classroom management. So I believe that the same way that the teacher has to be in control of their students and the classroom environment, the same way the teacher has to be in control of how their students use social media in the classroom. And in order to do that, you definitely have to make sure that your own digital literacy skills and your skills in using social media are up to date, so that you can guide your students.
Basically, that classroom management, I don't know when you were younger, if you ever had a teacher tell you to be in charge of the class, and when they left, that how the ruckus would start, or people would start doing other things, or that's just an example of what can happen if there's no structure about them learning social media. I think if you give them structure, kids like structure. I never realized that when I was younger, but if you're given the rules, most of the time you'll follow them.
Yeah, and that kind of ties back to the age-old question of like the two ends of the spectrum of teacher-led, very didactic sort of style versus a constructivist approach, or they even in this first reading talk about connectedness or connectivist.
Yes.
So yeah, it's always striking a balance between the creative chaos and innovation and the necessary order and structure that the kids need.
I think it's also worth mentioning how in the journal article, they stated that students were less willing to appropriate social media as a formal learning tool, and they instead preferred it for course-related communication or using it for socializing and non-academic purposes. So I think it's interesting, and we have to make that distinction. Just like I was saying, having knowledge of your students and what works for them and what doesn't work for them. I don't think social media is a one size fits all type of thing. So yes, it could be used to encourage communication between students and the teacher and between students themselves. But if it can't be used successfully as a formal learning tool in your classroom, I think that maybe you can instead just use it for communicating with your students. I don't think we should try to force something if it doesn't work for that particular group.
Yeah, definitely. And it kind of seems to be getting at that thing I mentioned where you have to start with the need and then the technology to fulfill that need instead of shoehorning any kind of technology in just because it exists as such. And that brings up like Twitter itself is kind of an interesting lens to look at this through, and was the entire subject of the last reading.
Which I think we can all relate to, considering that for our course as well. We send out at least 2 tweets per week. We communicate with our classmates on there. I think that's something that personally I was able to relate to very easily because we have that experience doing that for this class, and it helped me understand the findings from some of the studies. For example, how in one of the studies, every participant in the classroom was required to post at least once a week on Twitter. And for the results, they found that the students' attitude changed from discomfort to fun.
Yeah.
And that's something I can definitely relate to. I'm new to Twitter. I only made my account for this class. And definitely in the beginning, I was a little uncomfortable using it. But it's something that I definitely use even for my own pleasure now outside of class.
Yeah, I agree. And that with this reading, since it was pretty dense to start off, it was more interesting the deeper I got into it, because it was filled with these kind of facts about these 51 studies, especially in the appendix, the last table they have. It was fun reading through just these little 1 or 2 points, and how generally it was positively reviewed by the students involved, even if, like you said, Georgia, they were intimidated at first by the technology or just the being unfamiliar with it. They warmed up to it eventually. And yeah, kind of a similar thing with me, as you said, like I've never used Twitter prior to the class, and I find myself taking more enjoyment in the uniqueness of each tweet rather than like having to think that one tweet has to encompass so much. Like knowing that it's an ongoing thread, I can be less picky and just throw out different ideas. But Chris, prior to this class, have you made great use of Twitter, either just personally or through work stuff?
I first started with Twitter. I didn't really investigate it as much. I have a private business that I do. Well, I ended up doing marketing for people in education, websites, that type of stuff. So I used to try to think, well, how am I going to use social media to advertise people or to advertise their classes or to get people to be engaged? And I learned a lot more in this class about Twitter than I previously knew. I knew you could build a brand just like you can in business, and you can build a following. But I like the way that this class makes you think about what in the reading applies not only to yourself, but to society, but also our classmates and it really encompasses a lot. And it does make you think, like, what do I need? Like, what am I going to say that people are really going to hear and respond to? I actually made one successful post recently about an experience I had in school about being when they pick on other kids or they shame them. And it like brought me back to that grade school time. And I got a lot of positive feedback actually from other classmates and how they agreed and had similar experiences, which I thought, now identifying with, kids, teens, and being able to do that just makes you a more valuable teacher, because those things are still happening. They're just happening with technology involved.
Yeah.
So you can understand their identity crisis that they may have if you're a teacher, because just because you're a teacher, you're not just teaching content. You have to deal with the social a lot too. They train you somewhat about classroom management, but they don't train you how to. I mean, they give you psychology when you become a teacher, but you're not really a psychologist to deal with those emotional, and which can be very emotional because it really attacks their identity and they think their life's over. So
that's definitely true, Chris. And I remember that tweet that you're talking about, and I was one of those who responded to you because I thought that was a really great input that you gave us on your experience with public shaming and your opinion on it. And the reason that I think that's definitely very important is because, like you said, we're teaching the whole child. And especially nowadays that we have so many factors that can affect our students, and social media being one of them, that's definitely something we have to take into consideration. And if we as teachers can incorporate social media in a positive, meaningful way, in a way that counteracts the negative aspects of it, I think that it should definitely be used that way then. Like they say, if you can't beat them, join them, but in a way that you're using it to your advantage.
Yeah, and kind of thinking back last week to the readings. Yeah, like last week they were talking about the managing of your different media identities, and how the interesting question is, like, okay, if you do want to bring social media into the classroom, are you going to use it in such a way that the students mix their worlds, or will there be like a social media for education personality that the kid builds up through certain platforms and apps? And then I think no matter what, there'll always be, the kids need their own separate space where there shouldn't be education infiltrating every mode of their digital lives. But yeah, I think it's hard to predict until you're in the nitty gritty of how that unfolds in a classroom kind of kid by kid, like what the mix is.
Oh
Social
yeah,
media. Yeah.
I think that's why they came up with hot dish. I don't know if you looked in that article. It's Greenhow and Lewin.
Mm-hmm.
I think the hot dish was a special program they gave them that is connected to their Facebook. That's educational driven, like you're saying. Like I agree. That's what I think helps to keep it, because they're going on Facebook and then they're going at that hot dish. And they said that they would check the hot dish a lot. It kind of motivated them to still be thinking about engaging with their peers. Because I think, didn't they focus on like environmental type improvements as well in what they were doing with social media? I reread it just to check that was a focus. But I think they put that hot dish in there so that it kept the kids, based on whatever age group they were, separate, so that it wouldn't be, I guess, publicly ridiculed, and then actually classes that weren't involved, which is an unexpected event they had in this, which I thought was cool, is that other classes just happened to see it because they were on that hot dish, and they gave them like so much feedback about it. They didn't even realize that was being created, and that they were getting feedback, the students and the teachers. So that was something that was unexpected to happen by using social media that they may never have experienced if it wasn't part of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely something that we have to be cognitively aware of. We have to expect the unexpected. I think especially when trying something so new in the classroom. I like how Dominic brought up the issue of what do we do with the identity management issue. Will we allow students to there as well develop these separate identities, or will they be sort of meshing it up with the one that they already have? And along with that, there are so many other concerns that will be raised as this is being more and more incorporated in the classroom, that we just have to take one step at a time and figure out. It won't be a perfect solution from the beginning. I don't think it'll be a perfect application of social media from the very first attempt we make in the classroom. But practice makes perfect. And of course, that doesn't mean that you'll find the one perfect format or one perfect delivery method. But the more we do this in the classroom, the better we'll get at it. And every year you do have to be flexible. Every year with every new group of students, with every new grade that you teach, I think we will as educators have to be prepared to be flexible and look into new methods.
Yeah, people are getting a crash course on that in Zoom now with remote learning. Teachers that and you're being utilized very heavily, I would guess, Chris, for your
I actually had to write to our professor an email because I was being so inundated by, we have such a variety of learners working at the university, meaning, I always try to look at it in a positive way. We have teachers that are young and teachers that are in their senior, meaning they have a lot of experience in teaching and engaging students, but they never done it with technology because I don't think this has happened since, they said, almost a century. So it was never the expectation. So, a lot of times when, I make videos and I've been dispersing them, not that I don't have to teach them, we still teach them, but we give them the videos so they can rehearse it or try to remember it. Because, if someone tells you something one time, it's not always going to stick because it depends on the type of learner they are. So that's why I try to look at, I used to be in charge of educating the whole university, students, staff, faculty, and you always got to look at it in a way that, when you're talking about a teenager versus for someone that's been an experienced learner, which, may be in their senior, maybe getting close to the end of their career, or are they really going to want to learn it? But they really have to. So you have to think about how they learned back then and try to bring it to their level now. So Like, did they read about it? Did they have visuals? They were very, textbook oriented or blackboard oriented, or however they learned.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the multimodal learning. It's ever changing. So
Definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think we did a thorough job discussing our readings from this week.
So it looks like we all appreciate both sides of social media in education, and that there's not a total pro or con side. I think the important thing is that we're all open to the possibilities, and whether you are or not, it's coming, it's here, and it's part of these kids' lives. So it's just a question of how we best incorporate that. So thank you all for listening. I'm Dominic. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening, everyone. Gentlemen, it was a pleasure speaking with both of you. And tune in to our podcast. We hope you enjoy. Bye from Georgia.
And signing off, Chris Dotson. Thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. And signing off.
All right. Thanks, George and Chris.